Hey class, today we're going to start the muscular system. So this involves chapter 6 within your textbook. So if you open up your textbook, you will find all the information that I am talking about here in this PowerPoint. So make sure that you're not only using this PowerPoint in your notes, but you can also always refer to the textbook for information as well. Okay. So let's kind of get started with an overview of the muscular system. The essential function of muscle is to contract or shorten. And again, when they contract, they're going to produce movement. This is actually very unique and it sets it apart from other body tissues that we learned previously in this past year. So it sets it apart from cartilage, it sets it apart from bone, it sets it apart from dense connective tissue. Now, muscles are responsible for all types of body movement and usually can be viewed as machines of the body. There are 3 basic muscle types or tissues found in the body, and in fact, we've learned about these 3 different muscle types, so a lot of what you're going to learn today, you have already covered when we covered them in the tissue chapter. So the 3 basic muscle types, hopefully if you remember, are 1, skeletal, 2, cardiac, 3, smooth. Now, the way they differ in so many different ways, but the 3 major ways is cell structure, where they're located in the body, and how they are stimulated to contract. So do they contract slow or fast, or are they voluntarily controlled by ourselves, or are they involuntarily controlled and they happen without us telling our body to do that? So the first thing we're going to do before we get into those differences is talk about these similarities. Skeletal and smooth muscle cells are very similar to one another because they are said to be elongated. Oftentimes, when we're talking about muscle cells, we call them muscle fibers. So that's one thing I really want you to understand is that we're going to use these words interchangeably, but they mean the same thing. They mean that cellular level. Now, all muscles types are going to contract and shorten, and this is what provides movement, and it's actually made from 2 different types of microfilaments. We're going to learn later on this week that those 2 types are going to be actin and myosin. The last similarity we're going to talk about is like all muscle types are going to share some type of terminology. You're going to see the prefixes myo and mys, which means muscle, or you might see the prefix sarco, which refers to flesh. So these prefixes, when you see them, you are talking about the muscular system. It's similar to when you hear the word pulmonary, usually it refers to the lungs. If you hear the word cardio, it refers to cardiovascular system. Or if you hear the word osseous or os, it usually refers to bone. Over here, this is a table that you can find both here and in your textbook. This table compares those 3 different types that we're going to talk about coming up: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. It gives you different characteristics that are listed here on the side, and then it talks about each one individually and kind of gives you a description, pictures to help illustrate what they're trying to say. Now, one thing I do want to say is use this table to answer things in your notes or on your worksheet if it's not directly found on the slide in Word form. So know to check back with this table. So the first thing it talks about is body location, cell shape and appearance. So what's it look like? How are they structured? Connective tissue components. So you might actually have to refer here to this page when you're finding the connective tissue components of these 3 different types of muscles. Regulation of contraction. So is it voluntarily or involuntarily controlled? Speed of contraction. And does that contraction have some kind of rhythm to it? And over here, you're going to see yes for the cardiac. We have a rhythm in our heart, but skeletal not so much because I can reach out and grab something and not have to just keep doing it in a rhythmic way. So the first type of muscle we're going to talk about is that skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle fibers are packaged into organs called skeletal muscles, and they're mainly located attached to your skeleton. Now, these skeletal muscle fibers are attached to your skeletal system, such as bone, by something known as tendons. Now, they don't have to just be attached to bone. You can also attach them to cartilage, or in terms of your facial muscles, those have to attach to your skin to allow you to frown or smile. Now, skeletal muscles, if I were to give a description of them, they're pretty large. They're said to be cigar-shaped, and they're multinucleate. So hopefully you remember multinucleate means more than one nucleus. So they have multiple nucleuses per cell. In fact, skeletal muscles, if we're talking about their shape, they are the largest muscle fibers. A couple other things that we could use to describe skeletal muscles is they're also called striated muscle because they have stripes. And they're also known as voluntary muscle because they're subject to our conscious control, where we can voluntarily control these muscles. For example, if I wanted to pick up a pen, I could tell my hand, pick up that pen. Now, this doesn't mean that things happen without our control. In fact, we have reflexes for a reason. If someone were to tap my knee, even though it's skeletal muscle, I'm going to automatically kick out. The other thing about skeletal muscle is the speed of contraction. It can be slow, so if I want to slowly reach for a pencil, or it could be very fast, say I wanted to snatch it up. Now, one thing on your notes is you're going to find that it's going to ask about what it's made up of, the tissues that make it up. Again, refer to that chart. And then the keywords for skeletal muscle are skeletal, striated, and voluntary. Now, in terms of we're going to talk about that structure, which was located on that table, but we're going to go a little bit more detail about it, is skeletal muscle cells are surrounded and bundled by many layers of tissues. And this is the only muscle that really has so many layers. So I'm actually going to talk about these from the deepest to the most superficial. So if I was going to strip away all those layers, the very inside you have individual muscle fibers, or remember, fibers are the same as cells. Now, each individual muscle fiber is enclosed in something known as an endomysium. So that mice, again, means muscle. Endo will always mean the very inside. Now, all of these muscle fibers, if you collect a lot of them and bundle them together, so bundle of muscle fibers, they form something known as a fascicle. So a fascicle is just a bunch of these muscle fibers collected together. And then that fascicle can be wrapped in something known as perimysium. So I always think of peri meaning like the middle. And then if you take a bunch of those bundles and bundle bundles together, so it binds several fascicles, this is known as the epimysium. So it's the very outside. In fact, when you bundle several muscle fibers together, you're actually covering the entire skeletal muscle. So over here, this is a picture just to illustrate. Here you have an individual muscle fiber cell. So I'm going to write over here, covered by endomysium. Down here it shows endomysium also in between those muscle fibers or those cells because, again, it surrounds it. Then, if you take a bunch of those muscle fibers and cells and put them into a bundle, this is known as a fascicle, and your fascicle is wrapped by your perimysium. And then if you take a bunch of fascicle bundles and wrap them all together, you have your outside covering, or your epimysium covers the entire thing. Now on the next slide, we're going to talk about how this epimysium will actually blend in to either a tendon to allow your muscle to attach. So the epimysium blends into some type of connective tissue. An example of this could be a tendon. That's a cord-like structure. It's made up a lot of collagen fibers, and that makes it tough, yet able to stretch and move. Now, often you're going to find tendons wherever you're going to see muscles cross a joint. Now, the reason is because bones can have some sharp edges, And tendons are tougher, and they provide more durability, and the joint is less likely to rip a tendon than it is to rip a muscle, because those are a little bit softer. Tendons are also typically small size, so it helps conserve space. So the two things it provides is 1, durability, and 2, conserve space. The other thing it can attach to is, I'm going to butcher this, aponeuroses, neurosis. These are sheet-like structures that allow muscles to indirectly attach to bone, cartilage, or some type of connective tissue. The second type we're going to talk about is smooth muscle. These are located usually in hollow visceral organs. So these include things like the stomach, urinary bladder, your respiratory passageways like your lungs, and your airway. A description of them is spindle-shaped fibers. Sometimes you might hear the word fusiform. It means the same thing. And when I say it's spindle, another way you could describe that is saying that it tapers at both ends. And again, refer to that table and you can see a picture. Now, these are described as uninucleate. So uni is one nucleus. And one key thing about smooth muscle is that there's no striations, no stripes. And that's why it's said to be smooth. Now, smooth muscle, if we're talking about the type of contraction, it's involuntarily controlled. We have no conscious control over it. It's controlled by our nervous system, hormones, chemicals, and stretch. For example, we don't tell our stomach to break down food, it does it automatically for us. We don't tell ourselves to breathe. I mean, you can, but really, we have to breathe on our own. We have to do it. Now, the whole point of the smooth muscle is to propel substances along a pathway. So, for example, food through your stomach, urine through your urinary bladder, or even air through our passageways. What happens is usually these contractions are slow and sustained. We don't notice food going through our stomach. We don't notice whenever it's going through our large intestine and making feces. It's happening without us really having to think about it and tell our body to do it. So keywords to think about is visceral, non-striated, and involuntary. Now, if we were to break it down and talk about its structure, it's only composed of endomysium. Now, these smooth muscle fibers covered by endomysium are arranged into 2 layers, one that runs circularly and the other longitudinally. And what happens with these 2 layers is one contracts while the other relaxes. Now, this is important because when one contracts and the other relaxes, they're not only doing that, but they're changing their size and their shape. And that actually helps propel things through the pathway. Food through the digestive tract helps you empty your bowels, empty your bladder. So over here, this is a good picture of where it forms your ring. Here's one layer, your circular layer. And then if you were to look at the second layer, this is your longitudinal layer. So it's 2 rings that kind of retract and relax, contract and relax to help move things through. Okay. And the last type we're going to talk about is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle has striations, so it's similar to skeletal muscle. It has those stripes. It's involuntarily controlled through the nervous system and hormones. It's found only in the walls of your heart. So that goes hand in hand with involuntary. I don't have to tell my heart to beat. It does it for me. Uninucleate, remember that is 1 nucleus per cell. And the one thing that I do want to point out that differentiates cardiac muscle from skeletal muscle is these things called intercalated discs. If you look at those images and those pictures, that's the one distinguishing feature between those two, other than it being branching. And the last couple things is it contracts at a steady, slow rate set by a pacemaker. So your heart has a pacemaker in it that sends a shock that tells your heart to beat, beat, beat. And typically your heart beats at a constant, rhythmic, slow rate. Now, whenever you get running or you're exercising, this is where your nervous system comes into control, and it's going to increase your heart rate. But then remember, we have to go back into homeostasis, so it's going to go back to that slow rate when you rest. Now, the structure is composed of endomysium, and usually these endomysium that cover your muscle cells are arranged in some type of spiral or figure 8 bundles in which attach the skeleton of the heart. Before we head off, we're going to talk about a few functions of the muscular system, of muscles in general, because just like describing the types, we have to talk about the functions. Where all muscle types produce some type of movement, you have to know that they each produce a different type of movement. So skeletal, so let's say skeletal, are going to be your gross movements. So that means running, walking, jumping, smiling, so your facial structures, or frowning. If we were going to talk about smooth, this is going to move stuff within the body. So this is going to move food, your feces, your air, your urine. And then if we were going to talk about cardiac, again, this has to do with heartbeats. This is going to make your heart beat. So while all of them produce movement of some sort, skeletal muscle has 3 important functions that the book also wants to mention. 1, it maintains posture and body position. When you're sitting or standing, you are constantly fighting against gravity and using those muscles. Even if you're sitting still, one little adjustment, you are using those skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscle also helps stabilize joints. So where bones meet other bones, those muscles help keep those joints in place. So there's not a loose attachment. You don't easily dislocate it. If it's got a lot of joints reinforcement from the skeletal muscles, they're less likely to pop out of place. In fact, knee joints and elbow joints are very important joints that are going to have a lot of skeletal muscle. And the last thing is it generates heat. Skeletal muscle provides our gross movement, running and walking. Well, in order to produce movement, they have to use energy. And where do you get that energy from? ATP. So when they burn ATP, the byproduct or the product of ATP is heat. So the more ATP they use and burn, the more heat they generate.
Any remote learning students that are returning to in-person needs to come to the office at this time. All previously remote students, come to the office. Thank you.
Pardon that announcement. So, when you have heat being generated, this is a very important function of the muscular system to maintain that normal body position, temperature, or homeostasis. Okay. Now, before we head off, the book also wanted to mention a few other important functions as well. For example, it mentioned a few more functions of smooth muscle. So smooth muscle forms valves. Valves are also known as sphincters that regulate the passage of different substances throughout the body. So, for example, you have a sphincter between your stomach and your small intestine because it wants to make sure all your food is processed in your stomach before it moves on. It also helps you dilate and constrict pupils of your eyes. And then last one, it makes your erecti pillae muscles contract. Now, hopefully from the integumentary system, the erecti pillae muscles, you remember that they're found in your skin. And when they contract, they cause goosebumps. And then it also wanted to continue to talk about skeletal muscles because they do so much. They actually form valves that you're under voluntary control. So weird fact is that your anus has 2 sphincters. One's voluntary and one's involuntary. So if you really need to hold that poop in, you can. And that's actually, that valve is made up of skeletal muscles. And then last but not least, it encloses and protects fragile internal organs. Your stomach and your small intestine doesn't really get a lot of protection from bones. You don't have bones that cover them, but you have a lot of muscle. So your abs and your abducens protect that. So again, it protects internal organs as well. So that is the end of today's lesson. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you guys have a good day.